What if the most debated moment in all of history was not a myth, but an event witnessed, recorded, and defended even unto death? An empty tomb that no one could explain. A missing body that Rome could not produce. Testimonies of men and women who swore they saw him alive and never took back their words, even when faced with prison, torture, and execution. For centuries, critics have tried to explain it away. Some said the disciples lied. Others claimed the body was stolen. But none of these theories could silence the story that spread like fire across the empire. So here's the question. What if the truth is far stranger and far stronger than the doubts? Stay with me, because by the end of this video you may never look at history the same way again. Let's step back. The year is around 30 to 33 AD. The city, Jerusalem. It is a city brimming with tension, occupied by the mighty Roman Empire, watched over by soldiers in shining armor and crimson cloaks. Beneath their control, the Jewish people wait and whisper of a coming Messiah, a deliverer, someone who would overthrow Rome and restore Israel. And in this climate of expectation, Jesus of Nazareth appeared, a teacher, a healer, and to his followers, the very Son of God. His words stirred the crowds. His miracles amazed the masses. But his presence also threatened the powers of the day. The Jewish leaders accused him of blasphemy. Rome feared his influence could ignite rebellion. So under the authority of Pontius Pilate, Jesus was condemned. He was scourged, mocked, and finally crucified, hung on a Roman cross outside the city walls. This is not just the claim of the Gospels. Even non-Christian historians like Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, and Josephus, a 1st century Jewish historian, confirm his execution. To the Roman world, Jesus' death was a public event, meant to crush both his movement and his message. But something unusual happened next. The Gospels record that a respected member of the Jewish council, Joseph of Arimathea, requested permission to bury Jesus. This detail is significant. Why? Because in ancient Jewish tradition, criminals often received no honorable burial. Yet Joseph, a wealthy and devout man, placed the body in his own new tomb, a tomb hewn out of rock, sealed with a heavy stone. The earliest written gospel, Mark, preserves this tradition, showing us that this was not a late invention, but an event firmly rooted in the earliest Christian memory. And here's where cultural detail matters. In Jewish custom, burial before sundown was urgent, especially on the eve of the Sabbath. Leaving a body exposed was seen as shameful and dishonorable. So the tomb was secured quickly, sealed tightly, and, according to Matthew's Gospel, Roman guards were posted to prevent tampering. Yet even in those first hours, rumors swirled. Some whispered that the disciples might come by night and steal the body, staging a resurrection hoax. Matthew 28 verses 11 to 15 records that the chief priests spread this very story, bribing soldiers to claim the disciples had taken him while they slept. Ironically, this rumor itself confirms one vital fact. The tomb was indeed empty. For if Jesus' body had remained inside, the easiest rebuttal would have been to produce it, to silence the story before it began. So here we are, Jerusalem, the 1st century, a crucified Messiah, a guarded tomb, and whispers of something extraordinary on the horizon. If you believe Jesus resurrected, and that truth speaks louder than doubt, then subscribe now, because this story did not just stir a city, it shaped the entire world. Jesus was dead. There was no doubt about it. His execution had been public, brutal, and final. Roman crucifixion left no survivors. Soldiers were experts at death, trained to ensure that their victims never left the cross alive. For the Roman Empire, Jesus was finished. For the Jewish leaders, the threat was eliminated. And for his disciples, the dream of a kingdom had crumbled in an instant. The men who once swore loyalty to him scattered in fear. Peter, the boldest of them all, had denied even knowing him. Most went into hiding, locking doors in terror of arrest. Rome had spoken, and Rome's judgment was death. Yet only 3 days later, Jerusalem awoke to whispers that refused to be silenced. The tomb was empty. The earliest account, found in the Gospel of Mark 16 verses 1 to 8, tells us that women, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, went to the tomb early on Sunday morning to anoint the body. But when they arrived, the stone had been rolled away. Inside, a young man clothed in white declared, "He is not here. He has risen." Shocked and trembling, they fled, too afraid to speak at first. Matthew 28 verses 1 to 10 gives us an even more vivid detail. An earthquake shook the ground. An angel of the Lord descended, rolling back the massive stone and sitting upon it, his appearance like lightning. The Roman guards, hardened soldiers, shook with fear and fell as though dead. Yet it was the women, not the soldiers, who heard the announcement. "Do not be afraid. He is not here, for he has risen, just as he said." Luke 24 verses 1 to 12 continues the story. Women arrived at the tomb at dawn, found it empty, and were confronted by two men in dazzling clothes who asked, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" When the women reported this to the apostles, most dismissed it as nonsense. But Peter ran to the tomb, stooped down, and found only the linen cloths lying there, the wrappings of a body that was no longer present. And then comes one of the most personal accounts, John 20 verses 1 to 18. Mary Magdalene, heartbroken and confused, stood outside the tomb weeping. She thought his body had been taken, but when she turned, she saw him. At first, she mistook him for a gardener. Then Jesus spoke her name, Mary, and in that moment, her grief turned to overwhelming joy. For Gospels, for perspectives, but all agree on one central fact. The tomb was empty, and those who loved him most encountered something or someone that defied explanation. But here lies the conflict. The religious leaders had their answer ready. The disciples must have stolen the body. It was the most natural explanation for an empty tomb. Yet think of the difficulties. The tomb had been sealed with a heavy stone, guarded by Roman soldiers under strict orders. To steal the body would mean sneaking past trained warriors, breaking the seal, and removing the corpse, all while risking death. Even if the disciples had attempted such a feat, these same men were hiding in fear, scattered and demoralized. Would they have dared such a reckless plan? Still, the rumors spread. Some believed, others scoffed. Many were caught in between, wondering if this was a divine act or just another dangerous rumor that could spark rebellion. And through it all, the disciples themselves struggled with doubt. Even when told of the empty tomb, many refused to believe without proof. Fear locked them in rooms, silence gripped their tongues, and uncertainty clouded their minds. Whispers spread through Jerusalem, "He is risen." But is it true, or just another dangerous rumor? The reports of the empty tomb spread quickly, but belief did not come easily. Even among the disciples, doubt was the first response. Fear had already scattered them, and when whispers of resurrection reached their ears, they struggled to trust what seemed impossible. The Gospel of John 20 verses 24 to 29 gives us the story of one disciple who became the symbol of this doubt, Thomas. When the others insisted that they had seen the Lord, Thomas refused. His words cut sharp. "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and place my hand into his side, I will not believe." His demand was raw, honest, human. After all, resurrection was not the normal course of history. Dead men did not simply walk again. And then, 1 week later, the disciples were gathered behind locked doors when suddenly, Jesus stood among them. Turning to Thomas, he invited him to do the very thing he had demanded. "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Overwhelmed, Thomas fell to his knees and declared, "My Lord and my God." But Thomas was not alone in his struggle. Luke 24 verses 36 to 43 tells us of another moment. The disciples, frightened and confused, were gathered together when Jesus appeared suddenly in their midst. At first, they thought he was a ghost. Fear gripped them until he asked for food. They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it in front of them. This simple act shattered their doubts. He was not a vision, not an apparition. He was alive, flesh and blood, risen from the grave. And then there is the testimony of Paul. Writing around AD 55, only about 20 years after the crucifixion, Paul preserved one of the earliest Christian creeds in 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 to 8. He declared, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, and that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at once, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." This is critical. Paul was telling the Corinthians that the resurrection was not a hidden event whispered in secret. Hundreds claimed to have seen him alive, and when Paul wrote these words, many of those witnesses were still alive. His message was clear. If you doubt me, go and ask them yourself. But while faith began to take root, opposition grew fiercer. Matthew 28 verses 11 to 15 records that the Jewish leaders spread false reports. They bribed the guards who had witnessed the empty tomb, instructing them to say that the disciples had stolen the body while they slept. This explanation would echo for centuries, used by critics as the simplest alternative to belief. Yet the irony is unavoidable. Even their lie confirmed the one fact no one could deny: the tomb was empty. And so the disciples stood at a crossroads. Their leader had been executed in public shame. Their movement seemed broken, fragile, and destined to collapse. Yet now, they were confronted with encounters that could not be dismissed. Still, embracing this truth would cost them everything. Rome would not tolerate a message that claimed a crucified Jew had conquered death. The Jewish leaders would not permit such a testimony to spread unchecked. To believe was to risk imprisonment, torture, even execution. Would you hold on to faith if your leader was executed and the world mocked you? Comment your answer below. And if you stay silent, maybe it's because you know the cost of belief is higher than comfort. This was the struggle. Doubt against belief, fear against courage, silence against testimony. And in this struggle, the disciples began to change. The men who once hid in fear would soon become the boldest voices in history. But first, they had to face the moment of testing, and the turning point that would redefine their lives forever. The struggle and fear could not last forever. Something had to break the silence. Something had to change the despair into conviction. And it came in the form of appearances that no one could explain away. Two disciples, disheartened and walking away from Jerusalem, trudged along the dusty road to a village called Emmaus. Their hopes were shattered, their Messiah dead. And then a stranger joined them. He walked beside them, listened to their grief, and began to open the Scriptures. He explained how Moses and the prophets had foretold that the Messiah must suffer before entering glory. Their hearts burned within them as he spoke. Still, they did not recognize him, not until they sat together at the table. And as he broke the bread, their eyes were opened. They saw him for who he was, and then he vanished. This is the account preserved in Luke 24 verses 13 to 35. Two discouraged men transformed into witnesses who rushed back to Jerusalem to proclaim, "We have seen the Lord!" But the story does not end there. In John 20, we meet Mary Magdalene, a woman whose devotion to Jesus ran deep. She lingered at the tomb, tears streaming down her face. To her, the empty tomb meant only one thing: someone had stolen the body. She turned and saw a man standing there, thinking he was the gardener. But then he spoke her name, Mary, and in that instant, despair turned to joy. She recognized him, alive and risen. Overcome, she clung to him. But Jesus gently told her, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." Her testimony would become one of the most remarkable in history. "I have seen the Lord." Later still, at the Sea of Galilee, the disciples fished through the night but caught nothing. At dawn, a figure stood on the shore. He told them to cast their nets on the right side, and suddenly the nets strained under the weight of fish. It was Jesus. After breakfast on the shore, he turned to Peter, the man who had denied him 3 times. Now, 3 times he asked, "Do you love me?" Each question cut deeper, until Peter replied with anguish and devotion, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And with each confession, Jesus restored him, "Feed my sheep." This moment, in John 21, marked Peter's restoration, from failure to leader, from cowardice to courage. The appearances multiplied, in locked rooms, by roadsides, on the shores of lakes. Paul would later declare in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus appeared not only to individuals, but to groups, even to more than 500 at once. And Paul added a daring note: most of them are still alive. In other words, if you doubt, go ask them yourself. This is where history presses hardest. The disciples who once trembled in fear suddenly became bold. They faced councils, prisons, whips, and swords. Yet not one recanted. Not one reversed their testimony. They proclaimed resurrection in the very city where Jesus had been crucified, knowing that producing his body would end the movement instantly. But no body was ever found. Even critical scholars wrestle with this. The historian N.T. Wright argues that nothing short of a real resurrection can explain the birth of Christianity. And even skeptics like Bart Ehrman admit, something radical, something profound, must have happened to turn frightened fishermen into fearless martyrs. The disciples faced prison, torture, and execution, all because they refused to deny what they saw. And yet some today can't even click subscribe. Which side of history will you stand on? From fear to fire, from silence to proclamation, the resurrection was not only an event, it was the turning point that redefined everything. The resurrection did not end with an empty tomb. It became the cornerstone of a movement that would outlast empires, outshine philosophies, and defy every attempt to silence it. The apostles who once hid in fear stepped boldly into the streets of Jerusalem. They preached not wealth, not power, but the testimony that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. And for this testimony, they paid the highest price. Peter, once the coward who denied knowing his Lord, was eventually crucified in Rome. Tradition holds that he refused to die in the same manner as Jesus, asking to be hung upside down, believing himself unworthy of the same death as his master. James, the brother of John, was executed by the sword in Jerusalem. His death is recorded in the book of Acts, a stark reminder that following Christ meant sealing belief with blood. Paul, once a persecutor of Christians, became their greatest missionary after encountering the risen Christ. He carried the message across Asia Minor, Greece, and into the very heart of Rome. And there, under Emperor Nero, Paul was beheaded, not for wealth, not for power, but for refusing to deny what he had seen. One by one, the apostles gave their lives. Not a single one recanted. Not one admitted to fraud. Their testimony was not rewarded with palaces, riches, or glory. Instead, it was sealed with whips, prisons, and executions. And yet, their deaths only amplified their message. From the streets of Jerusalem to the farthest reaches of the empire, Christianity spread. What began as a persecuted minority became a faith that transformed nations, laws, and cultures. All of it rooted in one central claim: Jesus of Nazareth has risen from the dead. And even centuries later, the story did not lose its power. Skeptics who set out to disprove it found themselves confronted by the weight of history. C.S. Lewis, once an atheist scholar, came to believe that the resurrection was not myth but fact, calling Christ the Son of God. Lee Strobel, a modern investigative journalist, began as a skeptic seeking to dismantle Christianity. Instead, the evidence compelled him to faith. Their conversions echo across generations. The tomb could not be explained away, and its legacy still speaks. What was meant for silence became the loudest testimony in history. An empire fell, but the story of the empty tomb endures. And so the question passes down the centuries, from the apostles to you. Do you think the resurrection was a divine act, or a legend that grew over time? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. But if you believe history cannot erase the truth, subscribe now. The resurrection of Jesus is more than an ancient story. It is more than ink on parchment, more than lines in a dusty manuscript. It is a claim that echoes across centuries, that death itself was defeated, and that life conquered the grave. Empires have risen and fallen. The marble halls of Rome are ruins, its mighty legions scattered to history. Kings and emperors have come and gone, their power reduced to dust. But the testimony of a few frightened disciples, who swore they saw him alive, still endures. They carried their witness across oceans and continents, across generations and languages, until it reached us, here, now. And so the question is no longer about them. It is about you. The decision is not whether ancient texts are accurate or whether history can be trusted. The decision is what you believe today. The Empire of Rome is dust, but the testimony of those who swore they saw him alive still speaks. And now it speaks to you. If you believe the story still matters, subscribe right now. Because the same truth that turned the world upside down can still turn lives around today. And if you don't believe, then I challenge you. Would you have stood with the doubters who scoffed at the rumors? Or with those who witnessed history's greatest dawn? Tell me in the comments below. Your voice matters here. But remember this, silence is still a choice. The tomb is still empty. The story is still alive. And now, it is yours to carry.